Hello, everyone. My name's Brad. I started karate in 1966 at the Grimsby Arena with Sensei Shintani. When I first started, he wasn't there. He was in Japan with his mother. When I started, there was another black belt that was supposed to be teaching, but he did very little. He stood at the back of the class and did nothing. And that was common in those days for black belts to do because we didn't have a lot of black belts. There was mainly Q belts. In our club, we probably had 30 Q belts. And the brown belts that were instructing led a brutal class. I know the exercises they put us through, we wouldn't do today there because they were hard on the body. When Sensei returned, we weren't part of Wado Kai yet. We were Nippon Karate Do. So he was always dressed in a black gi, but the difference was he was always on the floor. He wouldn't ask the students to do anything that he didn't do. He could do more different types of push-ups than anybody I've ever seen, and he would do them, and he would have us do them as best we could. We did knuckle push-ups. We did bouncing on our knuckle push-ups. We did lift one arm up, and that we did fingertip push-ups where you lifted fingers up until you were on 3 fingers and did push-ups. He did push-ups on the back of his hands. It was just phenomenal. And what we did as far as basics, we did a lot of basics. Basically, he had a routine that he would go through all the time, which even included open hand strikes, which we don't do a whole lot anymore. The kiddy, shuto strikes, and there wasn't any traditional shuto like we do now. It was all splitting shutos. We practiced heinan katas, not pinans at that time. We did, the techniques were different. I know at that time he had a relationship with Otsuka Sensei, but we hadn't made that transition yet. That was coming. And we had actually on the floor one of Otsuka Sensei's black belts, who was Takeshi Yoshiguro, who was a Godan from a direct student of Sensei Otsuka's. And he helped out there and make that transition happen. But so as it went on, Sensei would change that were black belts. I remember the day it happened in Welland one day where there was a black belt hanging around at the back of the class, just doing his own thing. Well, he got him on the floor sparring with us all. And soon after he left the organization. But that was it. Sensei said, there's no more of that. If you've got your gi on, you're being part of the class. I don't want to see anybody just hanging around. If you're hurt, then don't put your gi on and stay out of the class. You can still have your input, but stay out of the class. So that happened. When I was young, he lived basically about 2 miles from me. So he would often pick me up and I would in the summer and I would go down and help in his property. He had a fairly large piece of property there. When he came to Ontario, he took care of an older couple named Groffs, and he took care of their property and he had that property. So I'd be there and I'd help him around. He would, basically we'd work on the property. Then I'd stay for dinner with his family, which included his wife, Lois, his daughter, Laurel, his sons, Mark and Sharman. I still have a connection with Sharman and Sensei or Sharman's son, Anthony, who would be Sensei Shintani's grandson. And they're very nice people. Anthony is actually a power lifter. So if you want, he's a big boy. And that, so, and play with his dog. He used to have a Newfoundland dog. I think it was Newfoundland. It was a big dog. His name was Bo. And we play ball with it out there and that. So yeah, there was a time he had a miniature village in Confederation Park in Hamilton, and he got the whole club out there, myself included, and we painted the fence. And that would include Sensei Lou as part of that club too, so he was out there also. It was, so this happened, and then I remember my green belt, or I was green belt going to blue, and he held me back. And he said to me that day, he said, he said, you don't have it yet. One of these days you will. He says, I know that in you. But he says there's people that will never have it, because he always talked about fire inside and explosiveness. So that's what he would always look, and that was the essence of his karate, was power and explosiveness. So he said, I'm not even going to have to tell you when you have it. You'll just know it. And he was right. So yeah. Then it came the time where he was starting to come to our house, and because he wanted me, we would put on 2-man demonstrations, but of course he wanted my mom and dad's permission because I was still a kid. Like, I mean, we're talking, I was probably 15 at the time. Of course, to get me out of school and take me to these demonstrations that we were putting on at high school. So yeah, and then we go to these demonstrations and he'd want bricks to break, and he'd stop at construction sites and just go in and pick up a couple bricks. He would always have the boards for me to break, but he never had the bricks. We'd always have to do that. And I stood, and believe it or not, I was the one, because we used to do this routine. Basically, when we used to have tournaments, there used to be a point display. So basically all the techniques that were allowed were demonstrated, and all the techniques that were not allowed were demonstrated. So I would do the kicks, believe it or not. It's hard to believe now because my kicks have really gone downhill. But anyway, he would do the punches, and I stood at the end of that punch, and it would come so close, but I never had any fear because I knew his control was there, and it was so powerful and so fast. You couldn't believe it. So I went on, and then he came to our house to ask if I could travel with Sensei Lou, because he was traveling down to teach in St. Catharines. So I did that. And then after, obviously, Sensei Lou gave me a good report, because when Sensei Lou went back to South Africa, Sensei Shintani asked me to start traveling with him and teaching in Southern Ontario, across Southern Ontario. So that turned into a 5 or 6 day a week thing. So I really got to know him. But really unfortunate part is, at that age of 15, 16, you're not realizing your own mortality and the person you're traveling with, his mortality, because I should have went home and kept notes every night of what we talked about. He used to enjoy talking about the athletes. He often talked about Muhammad Ali, because he was the big boxer at the time, and how he would fight him. He said, you got to get inside those arms and then just pummel his body, is what he said. So that's what he said about that. He enjoyed listening to Tom Charrington on the radio, which was a television or a radio program that he had on, and he'd laugh and he'd say, oh, Tommy, you can't say that, when he'd say stuff and that. So yeah, when we travel to Simcoe, it would be like a 3-hour trip. He'd pick me up at 4:30 in the afternoon, and he had restaurants that he'd stop at for coffee. we'd stop at one at the, and people knew when he was coming in because they'd be there to meet him. There was a well-known florist who had numerous flower shops, and he would be in the west end of Hamilton every night that we went to Simcoe, and we'd stop there, and since he would chat with him a bit, then we'd go on to Caledonia or Hagersville and stop in a coffee shop there, and he'd stop there. There'd be people waiting for him there and chat. The man had so much charisma that he just attracted people. So we would do that, and then we'd finally get to the club, and he would teach. And I look at people now when you ask somebody to teach a club and they go, "Oh, I'm not prepared." Well, many nights we would go, and it wouldn't be until I was on the floor, he'd say, "Oh, you're teaching tonight, Brad." And I go, "Okay." And it was just accepted. I just, and you can't have more. And I never thought it was pressure. I was just like a privilege because he was such a, you knew he was never going to say anything bad about your teaching. If he wanted me to teach something, he would definitely give me a heads up and say, "Teach this." Sometimes he'd just say, "Go with it." So I go with it. And it was never anything negative came out of him. It was like, yeah, that was good. That was okay, but, so it was never like, "Nah, that's totally wrong. That's okay, but maybe you should have did this." "Oh, okay, Sensei, I got that. I'll do that next time." And that's just the way it went. And you looked at it, he was so trusting of people. I know that people would do the wrong thing, and he would always say to me after, "Oh, I can't let that happen again. Those people doing that stuff." And sooner or later, you say, "Okay, Sensei, that's good. Don't let that happen again." And sometime down the road, somebody would do it again. He just always trusted people to do the right thing. And as we know, that always doesn't happen. We try to hope that people will always do the right thing, but it doesn't always happen. So yeah, it was a different experience traveling with him. And the stories, like I said, he talked about the persecution and the problems he faced coming to Grimsby and Beansville when he came from out west. He often talked about the internment camps. I mean, the persecution at that time towards the Japanese Canadian people was due to the fact that they were on the other side during the war. And a lot of people, we had a lot of veterans at that time. Some of the names he mentioned, well, most of the names he mentioned, I knew of. And he often talked about his baseball career and hurting his left shoulder because he was a southpaw, and then teaching himself how to pitch with his right hand and continue pitching. I mean, I've read articles about his pitching and the teams that he played for, and he's always been outstanding in each article that I've read. So yeah, there was that. And then there was, he would talk about a lot of different things. And he always talked about some of the people that we now have in our organization that weren't part of our organization at that time, and eventually getting them all in here. It was amazing, his trips up north with that group and his trips down to visit the people in the States and stuff like that. So it was great. I remember the day that they called to say that he had passed away. I burst into tears. Always a big influence on me and always continue will be. So that's about it. I mean, if you ever have any questions, you can always ask me.